In 2003, a German archaeological team announced a discovery that should have rewritten our understanding of Mesopotamian kingship. They had been excavating in southern Iraq, working the dry floodplains south of the modern city of Nasiriyah, following survey data that pointed toward a site consistent with the ancient city of Uruk. What the ground-penetrating radar showed them beneath the desert surface was a city preserved in extraordinary condition by the aridity of the southern Iraqi desert, sealed beneath the sediment that had accumulated over it across 5,000 years of abandonment. Houses, gardens, fields, canals ran between the residential areas in a pattern that the team's archaeobotanist, Georg Fassbinder, described in press materials that circulated briefly before everything changed as a kind of Venice in the desert. An urban plan of extraordinary sophistication, preserved intact beneath the ground. And on the edge of the site, separate from the residential areas, distinct in its structure and its orientation, the radar showed something that matched a very specific description that had existed in written form for nearly 4,000 years. It looked like the burial place described in the ancient texts. Uruk is not a hypothetical city. It is one of the most significant urban centers in the archaeological record, the world's first true city by most definitions. It was home to a population of 50,000 people at its height around 3000 BCE. It was the city that gave Mesopotamia its name, the region that corresponds to modern Iraq. The German team had been working Uruk's environs systematically, mapping subsurface features with ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging. The technology works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring the reflection patterns that return. Different materials, different structures, different densities of soil and stone reflect the signal in distinct ways. What returns to the surface is a map of what lies beneath without disturbing it. A way of seeing through earth and time without excavation. The structure the radar identified was positioned where a river channel had been, surrounded by the evidence of ancient hydraulic engineering. It looked like the burial place described in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest narrative literature in human history, predating Homer by 15 centuries. The epic describes the burial of Gilgamesh in specific terms. The river was diverted. The tomb was constructed in the riverbed. The river was returned to its course. The burial place was sealed beneath flowing water, hidden, protected, preserved. The radar data at the Uruk site showed a configuration consistent with exactly this kind of construction. A burial chamber positioned where a river channel had been, accessed through what appeared to be deliberate diversion infrastructure, surrounded by canal works that suggested engineering on a scale that required coordinated labor and technical knowledge. I want to be careful here about what the team actually claimed and what the evidence actually showed, because this story has been distorted in both directions, oversimplified into a confirmation that a specific tomb was found, and dismissed as fringe speculation with no archaeological basis. The reality is more interesting and more frustrating than either position. What the German team found, confirmed by Fassbinder to the BBC in April 2003, was a site that matched the textual description with enough specificity to take seriously. The structure warranted excavation. That was the claim. Not that they had definitively identified whose burial it was, but that the configuration was consistent enough with the ancient descriptions to justify the next step, which was to dig. But the figure the German team may have found was not Gilgamesh. The historical record suggests something more complicated. The Sumerian King List, the clay prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford that catalogs the kings of Sumer before and after the flood, places multiple figures in the same era and the same city. Gilgamesh is listed as the 5th king of the first dynasty of Uruk after the flood, with a reign of 126 years. His father is listed as a demon. His mother is the goddess Ninsun. But earlier in the same dynasty, the king list records another figure, a builder and unifier whose achievements in some accounts eclipse even those of Gilgamesh. That figure is Enmerkar, listed as the second king of Uruk's first dynasty after the flood, the king who built the city, who constructed its walls, who first attempted the unification of the Mesopotamian region under a single authority. Enmerkar is identified in the Sumerian literary tradition as a warrior, a builder, a religious reformer who instituted new systems of worship and administration. The epic cycles that survive in fragmentary form describe his conflicts with rival cities, his construction projects, his claims to divine favor that legitimized his authority. In the biblical tradition, this figure appears under a different name. Genesis 10, in the Table of Nations that follows the flood narrative, lists the descendants of Noah and the kingdoms they established. Verse 8 introduces Nimrod, described as a mighty hunter before the Lord, the first mighty man on earth after the flood. Verse 10 states that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Erech is the Hebrew rendering of Uruk. Shinar is Sumer. The beginning of his kingdom was Uruk. Scholars have identified Nimrod with Enmerkar on the basis of linguistic analysis, geographic correspondence, and the alignment of their described achievements. The phonetic relationship between the names, the shared association with Uruk as the first post-flood kingdom, the characterization as a mighty figure who established empire and built cities, all point toward a single historical figure transmitted through different textual traditions. This is not fringe speculation. It is a position held by researchers working in comparative Semitic philology and Mesopotamian history, documented in academic literature spanning more than a century of scholarship. The identification is not certain, but it is consistent with the evidence and taken seriously by specialists in the field who work with both the biblical and Mesopotamian source material. What the German team found in 2003 was a site that matched the burial description associated with this figure. A structure beneath an ancient canal, positioned in a way consistent with river diversion, preserved by the same geological conditions that had protected the rest of the urban complex for 5 millennia. Fassbender confirmed to the BBC in April 2003 that the site warranted excavation and that the configuration was consistent with the textual descriptions they had been working from. The team prepared to dig. The logistics were being arranged. The permits were in process. The excavation that would have answered the question directly, that would have established whether the structure was a royal burial and whose burial it was scheduled to proceed. Excavation never happened. 3 weeks after the announcement, the United States invaded Iraq. I want to address the timing directly and honestly, because the timing is where the narrative most easily becomes distorted. The United States invasion of Iraq began on March 20th, 2003. The German archaeological announcement had circulated in early April 2003. The sequence is actually reversed from the most dramatic telling. The invasion began before the announcement was widely distributed, not after. What is true is that the invasion made excavation impossible. The security situation, the displacement of academic institutions, the collapse of the Iraqi infrastructure that had supported international archaeological work, all of it ended the possibility of following up on what the radar had shown. Whether that matters depends on what you believe about the site. If it was an extraordinarily well-preserved ancient urban complex, consistent with the described burial place of the king who built the first true city in human history, then yes, the interruption of that work by a military invasion is significant, and its significance deserves to be stated clearly. Important things were not found. Important questions were not answered. That is not conspiracy. That is consequence. But to understand why those unanswered questions matter, you need to understand what was in Baghdad in the same weeks that the German team's discovery was being discussed. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad held approximately 170,000 objects at the time of the invasion. It was one of the most significant collections of Mesopotamian antiquity in the world. It contained artifacts spanning 10,000 years of human civilization in the region, from Neolithic tools to Babylonian administrative records to Sumerian literary texts recovered from sites across southern Iraq. Among its holdings were objects that had never been fully studied, cataloged, or published. Artifacts whose significance was known to specialists, but whose content had not been fully examined. Clay tablets with cuneiform inscriptions that had been recovered from sites across Iraq over the course of more than a century of excavation. Foundation deposit materials, objects deliberately buried in the foundations of ancient buildings for permanent preservation, a practice documented throughout Mesopotamia. Astronomical records, calculations of planetary movements and eclipse predictions that demonstrated mathematical sophistication centuries before the Greek tradition. Medical texts, diagnoses and treatments and surgical procedures recorded in administrative detail. Administrative documents from periods not yet fully understood. Economic transactions and temple records and royal correspondence that remained untranslated. In the days following the fall of Baghdad on April 9, 2003, the museum was looted. Approximately 15,000 objects were taken. The theft included pieces from the secured basement storage rooms, areas that required keys and specific knowledge of the building's layout to access. The selective nature of the theft was noted by investigators, including Colonel Matthew Bogdanos, who led the subsequent military investigation. Bogdanos is not a conspiracy theorist. He is a Marine Corps officer and assistant district attorney who was tasked with recovering stolen antiquities and documenting what had been taken. His investigation, published in detail in his 2005 book, Thieves of Baghdad, and in testimony before the United States Congress, established that the pattern of theft suggested multiple actors with different levels of access and different objectives operating simultaneously during the chaos. Some thefts were opportunistic. Display cases were smashed. Visible objects were taken by individuals who had entered the building during the chaos and grabbed what they could see, looting in the most straightforward sense. Others were targeted. Specific items were taken from secured locations, accessed with apparent foreknowledge of what was there and where it was kept by individuals who moved through the building with purpose and efficiency. Bogdanos was careful not to overstate his conclusions. What the investigation established was that the pattern was not consistent with random looting alone. Some portion of the theft appeared organized and specific, conducted by actors with prior knowledge of the museum's collections and layout. What was specifically targeted and by whom was not determined. The investigation documented the pattern. It did not determine motive. That distinction is important because what I am asserting here is not that the Iraq Museum was looted to acquire ancient knowledge or Mesopotamian technology or any of the more dramatic interpretations that have been applied to the invasion. What I am asserting is that a collection of incalculable historical significance was left unprotected at a moment of military action, that the theft that followed showed signs of organized targeting alongside opportunistic looting, and that the objects removed have not been fully accounted for. Approximately 6,000 pieces have been recovered through international cooperation and law enforcement efforts. 9,000 remain missing. Among the things that were in that museum, Sumerian medical tablets, astronomical records, administrative documents from periods not yet fully studied, and objects from foundation deposits of ancient Mesopotamian buildings whose contents had not been exhaustively examined. Foundation deposits like the ones in the walls of Uruk. The architectural tradition of foundation deposits, objects buried intentionally in the foundations of buildings for permanent preservation, is archaeologically documented throughout Mesopotamia. Foundation deposits have been found at sites across Iraq and Syria. They contain objects, cylinder seals impressed with the names of kings and deities, inscribed bricks that record construction dates and dedications, metal figurines of protective deities, and, in some cases, tablets. Tablets inscribed with cuneiform, sealed in clay envelopes, placed in the foundations at the time of construction to record the builder, the purpose of the building, the date of construction, and, in some instances, other information deemed important enough to preserve permanently for whoever would one day uncover it. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes such a tablet. It says that Gilgamesh, after his journey to the ends of the earth in search of immortality following the death of his companion Enkidu, returned to Uruk and inscribed on a lapis lazuli tablet all that he had learned. He had passed through the Mountain of the Sun, the tunnel through which the sun god traveled by night from west to east. He had crossed the waters of death. He had found Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the one mortal granted immortality by the gods, living at the edge of existence. He had learned from Utnapishtim. He had found the plant of rejuvenation at the bottom of the sea. He had lost it to a snake. He had returned to Uruk. What he brought back was not the plant and not immortality. What he brought back was the knowledge that only he, among all human beings, had acquired through that journey. And the text says he wrote it down on lapis lazuli and sealed it in the foundation deposits of the walls of his city. Not hidden by accident, deliberately preserved. The inscribed lapis lazuli tablet that the epic describes has not been found, but the walls of Uruk have been found. The foundation deposits in those walls have been located. Not all of them have been opened.